Let's prepare our hearts and our minds for the Word of God this morning. And we are taking our reading from the book of Philippians, the 4th chapter, and I'm reading from the New Living Translation. Therefore, my dear brothers and sisters, stay true to the Lord. I love you and long to see you, dear friends, for you are my joy and the crown I receive for my work. Now I appeal to Euodia and Syntyche, please, because you belong to the Lord, settle your disagreement. And I ask you, my true partner, to help these two women, for they have worked hard with me in telling others the good news. They worked along with Clement and the rest of my co-workers, whose names are written in the book of life. Always be full of joy in the Lord. I say it again, rejoice. The second verse, now I appeal to Euodia and Syntyche, because you belong to the Lord, settle your disagreement. I want to talk this morning under the subject of when church folks fight. When church folks fight. We're here in the book of Philippians. It's one of Paul's letters. Now, some time ago, it was actually about 1 year ago, July of last year, that I preached a message on Philemon, the story of love in action. And in that lesson, I went through a lot of details about the early church history, what the nature of the early church was, what the structure was. I talked about Paul and his letters and how the New Testament was arranged. And I don't have the time to go into all of that again, but if you would go back, you could go to our YouTube channel and scroll down to last year around this time and look for that message on Philemon. I think you will find a lot of material that was spoken then, very relevant to what we're talking about now and this letter of Philemon. I will touch on a few things, but again, do go back to that message. The Pauline epistles, about half of the New Testament written by the Apostle Paul. This section, this letter, is part of a section known as the prison letters, and it's simply because they were written from prison. Some people say that they were written from the Roman prison as he awaited execution. I disagree with that and find that he was more likely to have written that from an Ephesians prison before the Roman imprisonment. And again, if you go back to the lesson, I will give some of those reasons as to why. But 4 letters were written there. Now, out of the Pauline letters, almost half of them are contested. What that means is that many scholars question whether or not Paul was the actual author of these letters. And again, we're not here to take up that argument now. I personally have no problem with the Pauline authorship of all of these letters, but they, just for your information, were contested. The other half were called uncontested. What that means is that virtually no one disagrees that these writings are genuinely written by the Apostle Paul. And I bring that because in this here, it includes the book we're looking at today, the book of Philippians. It's uncontested. No one really questions that Paul was the author of this writing. Now, the church of Philippi, we actually have quite a bit of information about its founding and its inception. We find it in the book of Acts, the 16th chapter. And there it says, "From there we traveled to Philippi, a Roman colony and a leading city of that district of Macedonia. And we stayed there several days. On the Sabbath, we went outside the city gate to the river, where we expected to find a place of prayer. We sat down and began to speak to the women who had gathered there. One of those listening was a woman from the city of Thyatira named Lydia, a dealer of purple cloth. She was a worshiper of God. The Lord opened her heart to respond to Paul's message. When she and the members of her household were baptized, she invited us to her home. "If you consider me a believer in the Lord," she said, "come and stay at my house." And she persuaded us. Let's look a little bit closely at some of the information there. They traveled to Philippi. Philippi was a Roman colony. Now that's very important in understanding the culture and the history and the structure of this town and this church. It was a Roman colony. It wasn't Jewish. It wasn't all that together Greek, or while most of the world was Greek, this here was noted to be a Roman colony. And it was a leading city in that district. So it's an important area in that part of the world. Paul began to speak to women. The founding church of Philippi was actually a gathering of women. One of those women listening was from the city of Thyatira named Lydia. She was a dealer of purple cloth. She and the members of her household were baptized, and they invited her to stay in the house. There's quite a bit of information here. Lydia was a seller of purple. Now, purple meaning it was purple dye, which was very rare, very expensive. So this tells us that Lydia was a rather wealthy woman. It also says that she was the head of her household and that all of her household believed in her. Then the apostles and this early gathering, this very young church, was invited to meet and stay in her house, which brings us to the discussion of the church house. Now, when we read through Acts, we see that many churches actually started and met in houses. We see certain letters, including the prison letters, that speak about churches that are meeting in the house. Now, when we think of the church house, our frame of reference tends to be in our culture. And so we think about these small meetings, Bible studies, and we have them today. And many well-established churches did start in these kinds of settings. But we need to understand that when the scriptures talk about the church house, it's really not talking about something like this. First of all, we need to understand that the early homes of the ancient people were actually quite large, particularly if you were Roman, and particularly if you were rich. So when we look through some of the archives, don't think of a church house as a little apartment. They were very large homes. They had balconies and gardens, courtyards. Think about the old picture, the Leonardo da Vinci's picture of the Last Supper. You had at least 13 people sitting at this table. And they weren't there just for the night. They were there for the whole week. So that means this house, which was the home of Lazarus, who was a rich man, had enough room to accommodate all of these apostles, not counting any servants that were there, Lazarus, Mary, and Martha, not counting any family members that may have been with the apostles here. The homes of the ancient world were quite large. So they meet in Lydia's home, and she's the head of her household. The story goes on. Paul preaches and ends up in prison in Philippi. And he ends up in the Philippian jail. They beat them, they chained them, and there was an earthquake, and God delivered them, and they had the chance to walk out. The jailer of the prison came and he ends up getting saved. So we pick up that part of the story in Acts 16. The jailer called for the lights and rushed in and fell trembling before Paul and Silas. He brought them out and asked, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" They replied, "Believe in the Lord Jesus, and you will be saved, you and your household." There's that phrase again, household. Then they spoke the word of the Lord to him and to all the others in his house. At that hour of the night, the jailer took them and washed their wounds. Then immediately he and all his household were baptized. The jailer brought them into his house and set a meal before them, and he was filled with joy because he had come to believe in God, he and his whole household. There again we see the phrase of household. The jailer gets saved, he and his entire household were baptized. Now again, when we think of a household, we tend to think of mom, dad, 3 kids. Maybe grandma, maybe an aunt, but it's usually confined like that. Again, go back to the sermon preached last year. I spell out a whole lot about what the old Roman household was. And it's important to understand because when you do, a lot of these things tend to make a lot more sense. The Roman household was not just mom, dad, and 2 kids and a dog. The Roman household was built on a pyramid structure. At the head of the household was the paterfamilias. He was the head of the household. Now notice again, Lydia is called the head of her household. So she is actually the top person in her home. After that, underneath that pyramid is the immediate family and extended family. That includes all the cousins, nephews, aunts. All of them are part of that family, including the elder son, which is a particular title and position in a family. Under that, what we have is free men. Free men are people that were never really slaves. They were be more associated with employees. They were part of the household. Under that, there was freed men. Not free men, but freed men. These were men, people that were once slaves and had either been emancipated or they paid their debt and they bought their freedom, but they were all part of that household. Under that were the servants and the slaves. Now, all of these people constitute a household. So when you talk about the jailer believed and all of his household, he wasn't just talking about his wife and 2 kids. It could have very well have been up to 75 to 100 people. Again, Lydia, being the head of her household, included all of these people. Again, much more in the sermon from last year. I encourage you to look. Let's go back to the text of the Philippians. In the book of Philippians, every Bible student, whoever looked at this book would know that the frequent words used are joy and rejoice. It's all through the book. We see it in chapter 1. And because of this, I rejoice. Yes, I will continue to rejoice. Chapter 2, I am glad and rejoice with all of you. So you too should be glad and rejoice with me. Chapter 3, further, my brothers and sisters, rejoice in the Lord. Chapter 4, rejoice in the Lord always. I will say it again, rejoice. In every chapter, the word rejoice is mentioned. So it's clear that this seems to be the theme. Now, the unique feature about the book of Philippians, it's not a rebuking letter. He's not rebuking heresies like he's done in Colossians and Galatians. It's not a very teaching letter. He's not covering a whole lot of doctrines like he would do in the book of Romans. He's not straightening out all kinds of problems and sins in the church like he's done in Corinthians. It's an encouraging letter. We get some of our biggest encouragement verses out of the book of Philippians. I can do all things through Christ that strengthens me. So we think of Philippians, it's a very uplifting letter. And then almost out of the blue, out of nowhere, comes, I plead with Euodia and I plead with Syntyche to be of the same mind in the Lord. And here in this book, we find two women that are in a fight, that are in a conflict, that are having a serious disagreement. And Paul brings it to light. Those who know me know that I am from New York City. I was born and raised in New York City. And New York City, of course, is a very large city. It's like 1 million people. This here, by the way, is not a festival or some block party. This is kind of every day walking through the city streets of New York. It's a very large city, lots and lots of people there. And of course, what you would expect to find are many churches. There are thousands of churches. Some big, some small. I've been in many, many churches in New York City. Some very small. These are called storefront churches, which are very small, almost the size of an apartment. And I've been in these churches. I've preached in churches like this, where there was the attendance of 4 people, including the pastor, his wife, and his daughter. And I've been in large churches where there were hundreds, if not thousands, in attendance. Here's a church where the members of the choir actually number more than many churches have in their congregation. And when I went to church, and I got saved, and I went to church, the particular church that I was in was a very busy organization. I was part of an international organization, which means we had churches all over the country and even across seas. There were probably hundreds of churches right there in New York from this particular organization, some large, some small. This here church was actually one of the churches that I belonged to. And I had the privilege of preaching in this church from that pulpit many times when I was in New York. We had services. We had a service on Tuesday night, Friday night. Saturday we had choir rehearsal. Saturday night we had a young people service. And then we had Sunday service. Now Sunday service would start at 9 o'clock. And it would start with Sunday school, and everybody was in Sunday school, the children and the adults. That went to about 11 o'clock. We had a half-hour break, and service would start at 11:30. You would be lucky if you got out about 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. You think I'm long-winded. And then after that, we would go over usually to this church here, Refuge Temple, where there would be another service, evening service at 8 o'clock. And what I'm saying is that when you put all that together, I had the opportunities and the experience of being in church in terms of hours. I put more hours in 2 months of church than a lot of people put in an entire year. Now, what that means, doesn't mean that I'm better than anybody or even more spiritual than anybody. But what it does mean is that I had more exposure to church culture and church environments than a lot of people. And I wasn't by myself, of course. Many people from that background had that kind of experience. And in that experience, I have witnessed many, many conflicts in church. I've seen many disagreements and many fights. Believe it or not, I've actually seen a few fist fights happen in the church. Now, that was extreme, but it was not that uncommon to have long-term conflicts. And when you've seen church folks fight, when you've seen disagreements among the people of God, let me tell you, you will see a level of ugliness that you've never seen before. Folks can get mean, spiteful, vindictive. I'm talking about church folks. Now, there's a reason why that happens. You see, when you're in a disagreement with anybody, whoever you are, you have two people who obviously feel they're right and the other person is wrong. But when you put that into a church environment, not only do you feel that you're right, but because you're saved, your natural inclination is to be, because I'm right, God is on my side. And that, when you think that not only are you right, but God is backing you, God is on your side, God is in approval of your position, that will take it to a whole nother level. And so I've had the displeasure of seeing many churches that have split. Now, when we talk about a church split, it's a kind of misnomer because you think that, half the church goes or a portion of the church goes. A church split is when a large number of people end up leaving the church in a relatively short amount of time. And they don't always go to other churches. Sometimes they don't go to church at all anymore. I've had my share, I've seen my share of these church splits, and some of them can be so severe that I am aware of churches that no longer exist anymore because they've undergone that kind of a split. And I'm not talking about the smaller churches with 10 people. I'm talking about churches with 800 people that would undergo a split, and in a matter of time, that church isn't around anymore. When you see people leaving a church in great numbers like that, I've come to learn that you can't assume that when people leave, the problem is with them. And that's the first assumption we make. If you're leaving the church, obviously you're not getting something. Obviously you are on the wrong side. Augustine was attributed of saying, in essentials, unity. In non-essentials, liberty. In all things, charity. It's kind of a paraphrase of Augustine. It's a very catchy kind of cliche saying. But the problem with that is trying to define what is essential. You see, if you think the topic of speaking in tongues is essential, then that's going to be your battleground. If you believe that predestination versus free will is essential, then that's where you're going to have your fights. Whatever you believe or hold to as being essential, that's where the vulnerability of conflict will come in. Many churches who have undergone splits, ironically, don't happen over doctrine. I have seen churches that could withstand doctrinal conflicts, but what brings them down is the personality conflicts. That's what takes them out every time. Now, conflicts and fights amongst humanity is not unusual. We see that going all the way back to the garden. One of the first results of sin was conflict. Then the man said, the woman you put here with me, she gave me some fruit from the tree. Here we see blame aimed toward God and blame toward Eve. You did this. This is your fault. And of course, we see that only worsened with Cain and Abel, conflict that resulted in murder. We've seen conflicts from people, conflicts within relationships, conflicts in marriages and in families, fights among siblings. There's fights all the time in our lives. There are full of conflicts. That's not unusual to have conflicts. Now, even in the church, from the early beginnings of the church, we saw conflict. You go back to Acts, one of the earliest signs of conflicts happened in the very beginning of the inception of the church. In the 6th chapter it says, but the believers rapidly multiplied, there were rumblings of discontent. And the Greek-speaking believers complained about the Hebrew-speaking believers, saying that their widows were being discriminated against in the daily distribution of food. So right out the gate, we see disagreements and conflicts happening in the church. It was so apparent that Jesus actually gave a prescription of dealing with some of these conflicts. And we're all familiar with Matthew 18. A verse that has become very popular and is often misapplied and misinterpreted. Moreover, if your brother sins against you, go tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he hears you, you have gained your brother. But if he will not hear, take with you one or two more, that by the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses every word may be established. If he refuses to hear them, tell it to the church. But if he refuse even to hear the church, let him be to you like a heathen and a tax collector. Now, we could talk all day about this passage and what it means. But let me just point out a few points. What he says here is that if your brother sins, so this is a prescription for dealing with sin. This doesn't mean you go to somebody just because you don't like them or you don't like the way they looked at you. We're talking about sin, and it's a sin against you. In other words, there may be some things that are none of your business. Oh, I'm preaching hard now. It goes on, and this is where problems come in. It says, if they don't hear you, take 2 or 3 witnesses. Now, you need to understand, what is a witness? A witness is someone who saw or heard what they did. If they didn't see it or they didn't hear it, they're not a witness. You're just ganging up on somebody. And this is not telling you when you go and you confront somebody to try to straighten them out. If they don't listen, you just go and get some other folks. I can get anybody to come and take my side against something that you're doing or something that I think you're doing. One of the most popular, infamous splits and conflicts happened with Paul and Barnabas. And again, we read that in Acts. Sometime later, Paul said to Barnabas, let us go back and visit the believers in all the towns where we preach the word of the Lord and see how they're doing. Barnabas wanted to take John, also called Mark, with them. But Paul did not think it wise to take him because he had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not continued with them in the work. They had a sharp disagreement, and they parted company. Barnabas took Mark and sailed for Cyprus, but Paul chose Silas and left, commended by the believers to the grace of our Lord. It's a very sad kind of passage to see two great men of God, a team, a dynamic team, come to a place where they could no longer walk together. But even in this split, this disagreement, notice what didn't happen. While they had to go their separate ways, they didn't try to split the church based on their disagreement. They didn't try to pull out all those who are with me, come with me. All those who are with the other guy, you stay over there. They didn't allow their disagreement to infect the church of God. We've seen this before. How many times you have a family, been together for many years, and the extended family, and then there is a divorce. Now all of a sudden you have to choose sides. And now all of a sudden, the nephew that you used to talk to for years and hang out with, you're not allowed to talk to him anymore because they had a divorce. Or am I the only one here? And so the expectation is, since they're my enemy, they have to be your enemy. And if you're not willing to make them your enemy, then you become my enemy. And that's when things get really twisted and sinful. When your conflict is imposed on other people. Now, I'm not talking about if there was abuse and the guy was cheating on the woman and he was just a nasty guy. You're not expected to continue a relationship with it. I'm not talking about that. But I'm talking about now I knew this person for years, used to be able to call him and talk with him, and now because they got divorced, I have to choose sides. And I'm not allowed to talk to them anymore. Sometimes, however, it is important to let go. Sometimes you do have to get out. Sometimes you do have to leave. Now I want to talk about a very practical and relevant principle. When necessary change doesn't happen from the top, it will happen from the bottom. In understanding why churches split, why do people mass exit a church? Why do we have a church that had 1,000 people at one time, now they're down to 150? There are reasons why things like that happen. One of those reasons is this principle. When necessary change doesn't happen from the top, from leadership, it will end up happening from the bottom. And if it has to happen from the bottom, it will always be disruptive. Sometimes it will be destructive. Now, necessary change, I'm not talking about what you think needs to change. I'm talking about godly, necessary change. Things that are wrong, that need to be corrected. If leadership doesn't do that, after a prolonged period of time, it will start happening from the bottom. And when that happens, it can get ugly. You see it in the world. We've seen it in this country. What happened with the colonies from England? They pleaded, give us a break, get off our backs, stop taxing and abusing us. And when that didn't happen, what was the end result? It was a war, a bloody war. We see it with the civil rights movements. 100 years after the blacks are freed from slavery, they're not allowed to go into certain bathrooms. They're not allowed to drink from certain fountains. And years and decades of crying out for the injustice, and it doesn't happen, what was the result? you had riots. You had disruption. It happens from the bottom. Now, the point is, it didn't have to happen this way. If leadership had done what it was supposed to do, you wouldn't have riots in the streets. And a lot of times we're quick to blame the people that are protesting instead of looking at the top and why we came to this place in the first place. When you go to the scriptures, what happens in the Exodus? You have Israel put in slavery, being abused. God sends a word, let my people go. The message was to the leader. He didn't do it. I'm not going to do it. What was the result? Plagues, destruction, and death. When necessary change doesn't happen at the top, it will happen from the bottom. And when it happens from the bottom, it's always disruptive. Now, you could have people say, well, why did Moses bring all this trouble into our land? Well, Moses didn't bring it in. Pharaoh brought it in. It didn't have to be like this. It didn't have to be plagues and death if necessary change were to come about. We saw this in the Reformation. Abuses happened in the church. Men cried out. Men like Martin Luther, John Calvin, and the other reformers. And it didn't happen from the top. It happened from the bottom. And you had the Protestant Reformation. Repeated offenses that are not addressed will create apathy. And apathy will cause you to tolerate things that are not of God. Why do churches split? Why do churches have these fights? The essential is unity. But if you're following the wrong person, Paul says, be followers of me, even as I also am of Christ. In other words, follow me as long as I'm following Christ. But if you see and perceive that I'm not following Christ anymore, don't follow me. Because if the blind lead the blind, they both fall into the pit. Following the wrong people for the wrong reasons will always end in disaster. You can't stick with them and say, well, he was with me when my marriage was on the rocks, and he helped me when my family was hurting. And so you're staying and following somebody for the wrong reasons. Your loyalty belongs to the Jesus who saved your marriage, not to the man who God used at the time. Truth is more important than loyalty. When you displace your loyalty into men, you dishonor God. And that will cause divisions in your church. Let's go back to the fight here. We have two sisters in the church fighting. A sharp disagreement that was noted by Paul and obviously known by everyone else. I appeal to Euodia and Syntyche, please, because you belong to the Lord, settle your disagreement. It would seem like this message just came out of nowhere. But a careful reading of the book, you would see that it was coming. Right out of the gate in the first chapter, Paul says, whether I come to see you or only hear about you in my absence, I will know that you stand firm in one spirit, striving together as one for the faith of the gospel. In the second chapter, he builds on that. Therefore, if you have any encouragement from being united with Christ, if any comfort from his love, if any common sharing in the Spirit, if any tenderness and compassion, then make my joy complete, being like-minded, having the same love, being one in spirit and one mind. Do nothing of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking for your own interests, but each of you in the interest of others. In your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus. So this here was really not out of left field. This was something that Paul was leading to, because this was important. I plead with you, women, be of the same mind. I ask you, my true partner, this is an unnamed person, to help these two women. Why? Because it matters if there's disagreement in the church. It will infect. This church was founded by women. It's very possible that these two women were one of the founders of that church. And the way they conducted themselves would infect everyone else in that church. They worked along with Clement and the rest of my co-workers, whose names were written in the book of life. So it made a difference. It mattered that there was this contention between them. Paul would, in another occasion, said, if you bite and devour one another, watch out, or you will be destroyed by each other. The psalmist was found himself in a conflict. And he says here, if an enemy were insulting me, I could endure it. If a foe were rising against me, I could hide. But it is you, a man like myself, my companion, my close friend, with whom I once enjoyed sweet fellowship at the house of God as we walked among the worshipers. The deeper the love, the deeper the hurt. When you really love somebody, when someone who you really love hurts you, it's a hurt like you have never known. Well, what do we do when we are hurt by people we don't expect to hurt us? What do we do when we find ourselves in a conflict with someone that we really love? It's when we discover that being a follower of Christ, being a Christian, means giving up your right to be offended. It means giving up your right to be right. If you're more concerned about who's right or wrong, you're going to remain in conflict. There is no doubt that Paul was aware of the issue here. But you notice Paul doesn't say, well, let me settle this for you. This one is right and that one is wrong. He says, no, being right or wrong is not the issue here. Being at one. Well, how do we do that? How do we forgive people that have hurt us? We find the answer in the scriptures. Bear with each other and forgive one another. If any of you have a grievance against someone, forgive as the Lord forgave you. In other words, what he's saying is use what Jesus did for you as a basis for how you treat someone else. If you find it hard to say I'm sorry, if you find it hard to forgive somebody that has hurt you, then you just think about all that God has done for you. You think about how Jesus never pushed you away. When you think about all the things that you have done, some of you were drunks and he still gave you grace. Some of you were drug addicts and he still took you in. Some of you were liars and cheaters, but he still had enough grace for you. And then even after you got saved, there were times when you messed up. There were times when you offended God, but he still never pushed you away. He always had his hand out for you and said that I'll love you no matter what you do. I'll always forgive you. I'll never push you away. I'll never turn my back on you. I'll be with you always. When you think about that, when I think about how he brought me over, when I think about what he did in my life, can I worry about what somebody is saying about me? Can I worry about how somebody is treating me? When I look at all that I have done for Jesus Christ and he still put his arms around me, he still let me know that he loves me. When I think about that, it doesn't matter what you say. anyway. It doesn't matter how you treat me. I'm going to love you anyway. You can talk about me if you want, but I'm still going to pray for you. You can turn your back on me, but I'm still going to reach out to you. You can still call me names, but I'm going to forgive you anyway. That's the love of God.
Practical faith.